Let's take a look at question number 7 on the practice final. They want us to graph one period of y equals 4 cosine of 2x minus pi over 2. This is going to be the graph of the cosine with the following transformations. The amplitude is going to be the absolute value of 4, which is 4. The period will be 2 pi divided by the number, which is the coefficient of the x on the inside. That's going to be 2 pi divided by 2, which gives us a period of pi. Because there is some addition or subtraction on the inside of the trig function, there will be a phase shift. To find that phase shift, simply all you have to do is set the inside argument of the trig function equal to 0 and solve. So we need to know when is 2x minus pi over 2 equal to 0. You go ahead and solve that equation, and that should give you x equals to pi over 4. So that tells us specifically when this trig function is going to begin its period. It begins at pi over 4. We also want to know what the period over 4 is, because it's a sine or a cosine, and that's going to determine our key intervals. So starting at the phase shift of pi over 4, we also add the period over 4, which happens to also be pi over 4, to go to the right. So our important key point should be pi over 4, which is where it's going to start its cycle. Pi over 4 plus pi over 4, which would be pi over 2. I add another pi over 4, and that will give us 3 pi over 2. No, that's not right. Pi over 4 plus pi over 2. It's going to be 3 pi over 4. Add another pi over 4, and we will get pi. And add one more pi over 4, and we're going to get 5 pi over 4. The amplitude of this function was just 4, which means it's going to go as high as negative 4 and as low as negative 4. And then the other thing you need to know from this is, what does the basic graph of cosine look like? Well, the basic cosine curve starts the period at its maximum value. So it's going to start here at 4 when x is pi over 4. A quarter of the way through its period, it goes to a 0. Halfway through its period, it attains its minimum. 3/4 of the way, it's back to 0. And then it finishes its period back at the maximum value. From there, just kind of go ahead and insert your basic cosine shape. And this would be the graph of 4 cosine 2x minus pi over 2. While we're here, we're going to use this graph to get the graph of the function in number 8, which is the secant curve. Remember that the secant and cosine are reciprocal functions. Wherever the cosine has zeros, those are going to be the places where the secant has asymptotes. So these are going to turn into asymptotes. The high and the low points will be common points. Those mins and maxes are going to be common points amongst the cosine curve and the secant curve. And then as you approach an asymptote, the secant will always head in the opposite direction that the cosine did. So the cosine is going to head up here. It's going to head down and down. And then over here it's going to turn and head up. That's one period of the graph of 4 secant 2x minus pi over 2. And then all you have to do is repeat that shape either once to the left or once to the right to give the full 2 periods that question 8 is asking for.